So I'd like to thank Claudia very much for the welcome to St Andrews. My colleagues who've come from the Italian department here and from Reading in the case of Claire Honus, who will be reading Canto IX, and for the invitation to take part in this series of Lectura Dantis, which is really a very exciting initiative. And delighted to be able to start the day with a reading of Canto VIII. Io dico, seguitando, che assai prima che noi fossimo al piede dell'alta torre, gli occhi nostri in andar su alla cima, per due fiammette che vedemmo porre, e un'altra da lungi render cenno, tanto che appena il poteo l'occhio torre. E io mi volsi al mar di tutto il senno, dissi, questo che dice? E che risponde quell'altro foco? E chi son quei che il fenno? Ed egli a me, su per le succide onde, già scorgere puoi quello che s'aspetta, se il fumo del pantan non ti nasconde. Corda non pinse mai da sé saetta che si correste via per l'aere snella, come io vidi una nave piccoletta venir per l'acqua verso noi in quella, sotto il governo d'un sol galeotto, che gridava, or sei giunta, anima fella. Fleggias tu gridi a voto, disse lo mio signore, a questa volta, più non ci avrai che sol passando il lotto. Qual è colui che grande inganno ascolta che gli sia fatto? E poi se ne ramarca, fecesi fleggias nell'ira accolta. Lo duca mio discese nella barca e poi mi fece entrare appresso lui e sol quando io fui dentro parve carca. Tosto che il duca d'io nel legno fui, segando se ne va l'antica prora dell'acqua più che non suol con altrui. Mentre noi coravam la morta gora, dinanzi mi si fece un pien di fango e disse, chi sei tu che vieni anzi ora? Ed io a lui, se io vengo non rimango, ma tu chi sei che sì sei fatto brutto? Rispose, vedi che sono un che piango. Ed io a lui, con piangere e con lutto, spirito maledetto, ti rimani, ch'io ti conosco, ancor si è lordo tutto. Allor distese al legno ambo le mani, perché il maestro accorto lo sospinse, dicendo, via costà, con gli altri cani. Lo collo poi con le braccia mi cinse, basciommi il volto e disse, alma sdegnosa, benedetta colei che in te s'incinse. Quei fu al mondo persona orgogliosa, bontà non è che sua memoria freggi, così se l'ombra sua qui furiosa. Quanti si tegnono or lassù gran reggi, che qui staranno come porci in brago, di sé lasciando orribili dispregi. Ed io, maestro, molto sarei vago di vederlo attuffare in questa broda, prima che noi uscissimo del lago. Ed egli a me, avanti che la proda ti si lasci vedere, tu sarai sazio, di tal disio convien che tu goda. Dopo ciò poco, vidi io quello strazio far di costui alle fangose genti, che Dio ancor ne lodo e ne ringrazio. Tutti gridavano a Filippo Argenti, e il fiorentino spirito bizzarro in sé medesimo si volvea coi denti. Qui vi lasciammo, che più non ne narro, ma nelle orecchie mi percosse un duolo, perché io avanti l'occhio intento sbarro. Lo buon maestro disse, ormai figliolo s'appressa la città ch'a nome dite, coi gravi cittadini, col grande stuolo, ed io, maestro, già le sue meschite la intro certe nella valle Cerno, vermiglie, come se di fuoco uscite fossero. Ed ei mi disse, il fuoco eterno che entro la foca le dimostra rosse, come tu vedi in questo basso inferno. Noi pur giuniamo dentro all'alte fosse che valan quella terra sconsolata. Le mura mi pare anche ferro fosse. Non senza prima far grande girata, venimmo in parte dove il nocchier forte «Usciteci!» gridò, «qui è l'entrata!» Io vidi più di 1000 in sulle porte da ciel piovuti, che stizzosamente dicean «Chi è costui, che senza morte va per lo regno della morta gente?» E il savio mio maestro fece segno di volerlo parlare segretamente. Allora chiusero un poco il gran disdegno e disser «Vien tu solo, e quei sen vada che sia ardito entrò per questo regno. Sol si ritorni per la folle strada, provi se sa, che tu qui rimarrai, che li hai scorta si buia contrada. Pensa, lettor, se io mi sconfortai nel suon delle parole maladette, che non credetti ritornarci mai. O caro duca mio, che più di 7 volte m'hai sicurtà renduta, e tratto d'alto periglio che incontro mi stette, non mi lasciar, dissi io, così disfatto. E se il passar più oltre ci è negato, ritroviam le orme nostre insieme, ratto. E quel signor che lì mi aveva menato mi disse, non temer, che il nostro passo non ci può torre alcun, da tal né dato. Ma qui m'attendi, e lo spirito lasso conforta e ciba di speranza buona, chi non ti lascerò nel mondo basso. Così sen va, e qui vi m'abbandona lo dolce padre, ed io rimango in forse, che sì e no nel capo mi tenciona. Udir non potti quello che allor porse, ma io non stetti là con essi guari, che ciascun dentro a prova si ricorse. Chiuser le porte coi nostri avversari, nel petto al mio Signor, che fuori rimase e rivolsesi a me con passi rari. Gli occhi alla terra e le ciglia avea rase d'ogni baldanza, e dicea nei sospiri, chi m'ha negate le dolenti case? E a me disse, tu, perché io mi adiri, non spigottir, ch'io vincerò la prova, qualca la difension dentro s'aggiri. Questa lor tracotanza non è nova, che già l'usaro a men segreta porta, la qual senza serame ancor si trova. Sovresta vedes tu la scritta morta, e già di qua da lei discende l'erta, passando per li cerchi senza scorta, tal che per lui ne fia la terra aperta. Io dico seguitando, as I was saying. These are the opening words of Canto VIII, and they draw attention in a way to the fact that this is going to be a canto of transition. It continues material, seguitando, material that's already been broached in Canto VII, as you may remember from your last Lectura, and the episode isn't completed until well into Canto IX, so Claire Honus is going to finish us off with this continuous episode. The 3 canti together provide quite an extended narrative, which tell how Virgil and Dante character approach the river Styx, cross over it in the boat of Phlegas, and enter, finally, the city of Dis. So Dante begins this canto with, as I was saying. It's an unexpected opening, and perhaps a slightly banal one. But some of the medieval commentators who provided glossary on the Commedia accounted for this opening with a very romantic tale dealing with lost manuscripts, frustrated genius. According to their narratives, Dante actually began writing the Commedia in the year 1300, so in the year when the story of the journey is actually set. But they go on to explain that when he was banished from Florence on political grounds in January 1302, he was naturally forced to leave everything behind in Florence, including all of his papers. So the comedy was stopped. The papers were packed up rather hastily, put away, nobody knew what had become of them. And only several years later, some family business prompted his wife to go through the papers rather more carefully. And at this point, the first drafts of the opening canti of the Inferno were rediscovered. Some of Dante's literary friends came along and praised the poetic excellence of these texts and sent them off to the exiled writer. In my image, we can see Dante's expulsion and then his resumption of the poem in his study in exile. So the story is that when he was finally able to resume work on the poem, of which he'd only completed 7 cantos, he decided to begin Canto VIII with a very emphatic seguitando, as he picked up his own narrative thread once again. It's a story that's repeated by several of the commentators of the 14th century, as I said, and there are various kind of twists and embellishments that different versions offer us. Certainly, it confers on the opening line of Canto VIII a quality of drama, pathos, that otherwise might be lacking. But the credibility of the story remains fairly dubious. And in fact, one of the narrators of a particularly elaborate version of the tale, Giovanni Boccaccio, whom you may know as a teller of tall stories from the Decameron, tells a fancy version of this story, but then casts doubt on the narrative that he's just completed, when he points out that the first 7 canti include several statements about Dante's own exile, which could only have been written, he says, after 1302. He comments dryly that Dante was no clairvoyant. So he dismisses the story he himself has just told about the genesis of Canto VIII. Certa cosa è che Dante non aveva spirito profetico, per lo quale egli potesse prevedere e scrivere, e a me pare essere molto certo che egli scrisse ciò poiché fu avvenuto. E però mal si confanno le parole di costoro, cioè di quelli che dicono di aver scoperto il manoscritto, con quello che mostra essere stato. So the natural question is, if Boccaccio is going to explode his own story, what was the point of including it in the first place? And the answer, I think, is that the legend of the manuscript that was lost and then refound in Dante's Florentine exile brings political history and morality into the foreground for this canto. The story is a valuable one to a reader of Canto VIII because it directs our attention to some key elements in the sequence, and in particular, it focuses attention onto the Florentine political concerns that are raised, firstly, through the violent encounter with Filippo Argenti in the middle of the Styx, and next, through the image of the exclusion of Dante character from the locked city of Dis towards the end of the canto. Boccaccio was one of the earliest and the most enthusiastic proponents of Dante's rehabilitation by his native Florence, consistently arguing that the city should set aside the kind of political minutiae of a past history that had led to Dante's banishment. Instead, he said that Florence should take pride in this native son who's a great poet, a scholar, a serious moralist, and take enjoyment in the prestige that this figure could bring to the city. As far as Canto VIII is concerned, the story about the lost manuscript, with its reference to Dante's highly contentious experience of exile, prepares us, therefore, to look for serious political matter in the sequence, rather than simply hurrying through it as an episode of transition, as I was saying, between a story begun in Canto VII and finishing in Canto IX. So in my own reading today, I'm going to follow this hint that I think Boccaccio has provided for us, and focus primarily on questions relating to politics and to the life of the city, especially the city of Florence, that I think are raised in the canto. The image of the city, la città che nome dite, dominates most of the canto. I've chosen this image by Botticelli to show you, because I think it includes simultaneously all of the episodes that take place in the canto. And you can see that civic structures frame the whole of the canto in a way. At the very beginning, at the top right-hand corner of the image, we see Virgil and Dante standing beside a watchtower, un'alta torre, that forms part of the outlying circle of defences of the city of Dis. In the middle section, they cross the Styx in Phlegyas's boat, and they see how the swampy river is channeled to form a moat around the city walls. And finally, in the last section of the canto, they disembark next to the gate of the walled city itself, the tallest tower that you can see right in the front. So the whole canto presents a picture of Dis as a city, and one that has this very elaborate fortification system which displays its hostile, belligerent character that Dante and Virgil will find so problematic. The canto ends with that dramatic slamming of the gates in the travellers' faces by the demonic inhabitants of the city of Dis, preparing to repel Dante's character, a living human whom they refuse to admit to their dead kingdom, the regno della morta gente. So the watchtower, the moat and dyke, and the inner walls that surround Dis are typical of the elaborate systems of defences that were used by many towns in medieval Italy. An image of one of the famous fortified towns of Tuscany. And this, I think, gives a partly realistic and familiar quality to Dante's description of Lower Hell as a fortified city. And I thought this was going to be a difficult point to make as a first-time visitor to St. Andrew's. Walking around yesterday, I realised that I don't have to tell you anything about towers and the way that they loom over a medieval skyline. So I could have included a Scottish rather than a Tuscan picture to make my point. But what I think is that this quite realistic description again reinforces that quite stark theme through the canto of the kind of armed hostility that characterised the politics of the Italian peninsula for so much of Dante's own lifetime, and of which, of course, he himself was a victim. As an exile from his hometown of Florence, the historical Dante had endured the reality of finding city gates closed against him. And in a lyric poem that he composed in the early period of his exile, he uses this image very eloquently, talking about how Fiorenza, la mia terra, fuor di sé mi serra, vuota d'amore e nuda di pietate. You can see the parallel in the Inferno, when the harsh rejection offered by the devils of Dis to the two travellers similarly sees the city gate slamming shut in the face of Virgil. Chiuser le porte, quei nostri avversari nel petto al mio Signor. So for Dante poet, we can see that the image of the locked city is a potent one in terms of his own Florentine citizenship. And additionally, there's another reminder in the canto of the problematic, the confrontational side of Florentine community life, when the sinner Filippo Argenti mounts an attack on Dante's character, Dante's persona within the poem, attempting to drag him overboard from the boat of Phlegyas into the mud of the Styx. And again, we can turn to medieval commentators like Boccaccio to get a bit more information about the meaning of this episode. They tell us that the Florentine nobleman is Filippo Argenti de Caviccioli degli Adimari. So he comes, he's a figure who was renowned in his own time for having a rather arrogant and harsh personal character. But he also comes from this family, the Adimari, that was ranged in the political faction that was opposed to Dante himself and that ended up being involved in the orchestration of his political banishment from Florence. So there's a very direct and personal feeling that lies behind Dante poet's rather strikingly unsympathetic image of Filippo Argenti, this mud-covered figure who kind of looms out of the swamp and eventually falls back into it. And certainly, both the attempted violence of Filippo Argenti against Dante's character and the slamming shut of the gates of the city of Dis give the experience of the protagonist in Canto VIII
some of the same dangerous and destructive quality that Dante the poet asserted to be characteristic of the real political life of his home city of Florence. The attempt by Filippo Argenti to assault Dante's character and to force him to sink into the mud of the Styx, as he himself has done, demonstrates the kind of quick-tempered arrogance that was reputedly characteristic of the traditional nobility of medieval Florence, the so-called magnates, or great people of the city. And the Adimari family had a reputation in the 13th century for behaving with this typical kind of haughtiness, but a reputation that was complicated by the accusation that the family had rather undistinguished origins. They were nouveau riche, incomers to the city who were unworthy of the kind of pretensions to high social position that they displayed. And so their arrogant behaviour was doubly unjustified, if you like. Not only is arrogant behaviour unpleasant in itself, but it's being displayed by people who have no social grounds for doing so. Dante provides, much later in the Commedia, in Canto 16 of the Paradiso, a kind of review of the history of Florence, in which he precisely draws attention to these humble family origins of the Adimari family. And he accuses the whole lineage group of this double political failing. On the one hand, he says, they're very over-accommodating and submissive to the powerful or the wealthy. But on the other hand, they're excessively prone to victimize people who they regard as defenseless. He describes the family as l'oltracottata schiatta, che s'indraca dietro a chi fugge, e a chi mostra il dente over la borsa come agnel si placa. And then he comments that this family venia su di picciola gente. So in Canto 16 as well, there seems to be a rather strong personal feeling in the image, particularly of the family's over-vehement persecution of people in flight, people, the dietro a chi fugge, which recalls once again Dante's sense that his own exile was the product of the kind of corruption and injustice that was typical of the factional prejudice in medieval Florence. And this same pejorative attitude to the Adimari family is certainly present in the confrontation between Dante and Filippo Argenti in the Styx. Dante's final image of Argenti's angry characteristics shows him flying into an outbreak of self-destructive rage and biting himself in the kind of frenzy of anger that he falls into. He comments that il fiorentino spirito bizzarro in se medesimo si volvea coi denti. And again, I think there's a reinforcement of the kind of consistency that Dante brings to his depiction of this particular Florentine family in the Commedia, if we turn once again to the commentary tradition. Boccaccio's notes on the cantos include a particular pointer towards the choice of adjective, bizzarro, that describes Filippo Argenti, where he specifies that this adjective is a specifically Florentine dialect term. Il fiorentino spirito bizzarro, cioè iracundo. E credo questo vocabolo bizzarro sia solo dei fiorentini e suona sempre in mala parte, perciò che noi teniamo bizzarri coloro che subitamente e per ogni picciola cagione corrono in ira, né mai da quella per alcuna dimostrazione rimuovere si possono. So if the Florentines have had to coin a kind of special vocabulary for this type of impetuous and unjustified anger, it suggests that their civic life is especially prone to the outbreaks of this kind of destructive passion. Filippo Argenti, both as an individual but also, and equally significantly, as a member of the arrogant Adimari family, stands as the most extreme case of what seems to be an already overdeveloped capacity of the Florentines for violent rage. Boccaccio's specification that a particular variety of anger is designated by the adjective bizzarro points us towards another aspect of the canto that's been the object of debate in the commentary tradition. That's the question of whether and how Dante poet may intend to illustrate different aspects of the sin of anger in this sequence. The normal treatment is to turn to Thomas Aquinas, well known to have been an authority Dante respected very much, and to look at the way that he divided anger into three categories, speaking about the characteristics of three different temperaments of angry person: the acuti, difficiles, and amari, the quick-tempered, the vindictive, and the sullen. And judging by the action of Filippo Argenti in the canto, there's considerable debate as to whether he represents better the characteristics of the first category, the acuti, or the second, the difficiles. But Aquinas also points towards a more positive side of anger, the idea of ira bona, which he categorizes as zelum, or mansuetudine, a kind of righteous indignation against wrongdoing. And this positive anger is normally, this presentation of a good side to anger, can be used to explain the reasons why Dante character, our hero, if you like, in the Commedia, is able to get away with that rather harsh response to Filippo Argenti, which involves both insulting him verbally and also physically wanting to see Filippo attacked and pushed underneath the mud of the sticks. We note that Virgil gives an almost excessively enthusiastic approval to Dante's reaction. He embraces him, he kisses him, he blesses him, and he praises him as an alma stegnosa. So the complexity of that interaction, Dante's anger against Filippo Argenti and Virgil's praise for it, is obviously something that one could go into in a considerable amount of detail. I'm afraid that for today I've decided to hop over that a little bit. What I want to do instead is to move into another aspect of the sin of anger that is pulled out in the words that Virgil uses in reaction to Dante character and his response to Filippo Argenti, when he describes Filippo as a persona orgogliosa. This brings the sin of pride into prominence in the canto. And so Virgil's words seem to extend the moral and the political implications of the episode that I've been trying to examine so far, primarily in terms relating to Dante's feeling about Florence and about his relationships with its powerful families and the rivalries between them. In biblical tradition, as you know, pride is the primary sin, the root of all others. Initium peccati omnis superbia, we can find in Ecclesiasticus. And by tradition, pride was the motivation behind the great falls of creation history, the fall of Lucifer and his rebel angels, and the fall also of Adam and Eve. And this is the kind of issue, this idea of pride motivating actions with terrible consequences that radically change the fortunes of the individual concerned. When Virgil draws out from the example of Filippo Argenti a general moral principle. Quanti si tegnono or lassù gran reggi, che qui staranno come porci in brago, di sé lasciando orribili dispregi. So, if you recall in Canto VII, we heard about the principle of fortune, the idea that the great will fall from their high position. And Virgil's comment directs our attention towards the idea that pride, not simply anger, is that this traditional sin failing that brings about the fall of kings and of leaders. And of course, in Florence, pride is also the characteristic that was displayed by magnate dynasties such as the Adimari family, who sought to control the city's government. So Dante's Florentine feelings perhaps coming through here as well. We'll learn repeatedly throughout the Inferno that Florence, in Dante poet's view, has been corrupted by a trio of sins, which begins with the sin of pride. Superbia, invidia, ed avarizia are listed many times in the course of the Inferno. They were mentioned first in Canto VI, which again you've heard about in your previous set of Lectura, by the sinner Ciacco. The same list is presented in slightly reformulated terms by Brunetto Latini and by other Florentine sinners in Cantos 15 and 16 of the Inferno, and so on. And in fact, you can see that there's a continuity of this concern with the three sins, beginning with the sin of diabolical pride, but also including envy and the avaricious desire for money, as a typically Florentine set of characteristics which runs right the way through and reappears again in Canto 9 of the Paradiso, when Dante character is told quite emphatically by a paradisal soul that his hometown is so dedicated to sin that it has an almost infernal, diabolical quality to it. La tua città, che di colui è pianta, che pria volse le spalle al suo fattore, e di cui è l'invidia tanto pianta, produce e spande il maledetto fiore, che disfeate le pecore e gli agni, però che fatto al lupo del pastore. Florence, the city of the devil. So with Filippo Argenti, pride as well as anger is introduced into the range of sins that's represented in Canto 8 of the Inferno. And this provides an appropriate continuity with the next phase of the episode, when Virgil and Dante character come to the city of Dis. Dis, of course, is another name for Lucifer, by that association, conflation of the Christian figure of supreme evil with the classical lord of the pagan underworld, Dis, Pluto. Although Florence can be described in Paradiso 9 as metaphorically founded by the devil, this city in Inferno 8 genuinely is the city of Dis, of Lucifer, the devil's own city. Lucifer himself is going to be encountered right at the centre of the circles that embrace the varying levels of the Inferno in Canto 34. But even here in Canto 8, the outlying walls of the city are defended by a large army, a grande stuolo, of thousands of the devils who fell from heaven under Lucifer's leadership, più di 1000 da ciel piovuti. The devils who stand on the battlements and by the entry of Dis in Canto 8 are described with a number of adjectives that stress their sinful combination of anger and of pride. They display tracottanza, pride. They speak stizzosamente, aggressively. And they show towards Virgil and Dante grande disdegno, great contempt. But with this term, grande disdegno, again, we come into an area of some ambiguity about this city of Dis. The term itself is a bit of a giveaway. We've already heard Dante character being praised by Virgil when he was expressing his dislike for Filippo Argenti, being called an alma stegnosa. So stegno and disdegno, displayed by Dante himself, but also by the devils, seem to be qualities that are right on that cusp between justified and unjustified aspects of anger, the ira bona and the ira mala of Thomas Aquinas. And if we think about the situation of the city of Dis a little further, we can perhaps find some justification for the devil's rejection of Dante character's attempt to journey into their city, for viewing this passage through the underworld as something that's illicit. When it comes to the confrontation between Dante or Virgil and the devils, they apply a logical style of argumentation to try to query the entry into the city of Dis on rather legalistic grounds. And with this presentation of the devil as a logician. We pick up a theme that will be made quite explicit later on in the Inferno. In Canto 27, there's a wonderful little vignette of a struggle between the powers of heaven and hell over the soul of a dying sinner, which the devil wins through the rigorous application of logical argument. So here in this, we find the devils beginning by asking, chi è costui, chi senza morte va per lo regno della morta gente? And with the double repetition of morte and morta, they suggest that because Dante's character isn't dead, he shouldn't be able to enter the kingdom of the dead. And the logical conclusion of that is that they should send him back to earth, a kind of banishment, again, with interesting resonance for Dante's theme of exile in this canto, sending him away from the closed city. They tell him, «Quei sen vada, che si ardito intrò per questo regno. Sol si ritorni per la folle strada, provi se sa». So it's a kind of challenge, aggression, but also a logically defensible one. When the devils of Dis try to apply against Dante's character the general rule of hell, that only the souls of the dead, of unrepentant sinners, can legitimately proceed into the circles of punishment. It's the same kind of assumption that we saw, that in fact was seen earlier in the canto, when Phlegyas expressed considerable anger against the desire of Dante's character in Virgil to cross the Styx. He calls it a grande inganno, a kind of trick or deception, because neither the soul of Virgil, which belongs in limbo, nor the protagonist's still living soul will actually fit the criteria for people who ought to cross the Styx and enter Dis. And there's a similar kind of resentment, a feeling that Dante is breaking the rules, which you'll have seen earlier in the Inferno with other guardians of the infernal circles like Charon in Canto 3 or Pluto in Canto 7. So according to the logic of a purely infernal system of regulation, the journey can be correctly described by the devils as a folle strada, an arrogant straying beyond the ordinary conventions of this place. This expression, folle strada, is a term that brings a resonance for the Dante student with another illicit journey that will be described in the Inferno. In Canto 26 of the Inferno, Dante character meets the soul of Ulysses, and here's an alternative ending to the story of the Greek hero, where instead of returning to Ithaca, he sets off into the unknown and ends up shipwrecked. In the Commedia, that supposed last journey of Ulysses is twice described with a similar terminology. It's a folle volo in Inferno 26. It's a varco folle in Paradiso 27. And in both cases, this folle journey is described as somehow analogous to the defiant trespass across limitations that was shown by Adam and Eve or by Lucifer. So Dante's character is following a similarly folle strada, according to the devil's argumentation, by trying to descend into hell while still alive. So he's similarly crossing a boundary, overturning a fixed rule. But of course, this logical system that the devils are trying to use can be undermined. And Virgil is able to produce for Dante a reassuring counterexample and an absolutely incontrovertible one, showing that Lucifer's city can't withstand a higher authority, the authority of divine law, the law of God. Earlier in history, the devil's pride, the tracotanza, has been tested and overcome with an irrevocable defeat. And this was in consequence of the redemptive intervention of God in human history through the crucifixion of Christ and the resurrection. In the intervening period between the crucifixion and the resurrection, medieval tradition held that Christ descended to the underworld and conducted a harrowing of hell, a removal from the limbo of the patriarchs of the souls of believers, and conducted these virtuous souls into paradise along with himself. So Virgil reminds Dante that in that single episode, Christ definitively broke down the defences of the Regno della Morta Gente and overcame diabolic pride once and for all. Questa lor tracotanza non è nova, che già l'usaro a men segreta porta, la qual senza serame ancor si trova. Sovresta vedestu la scritta morta. With that last line, Virgil reminds his charge that he has himself physically witnessed the physical marks that were left behind by Christ's triumph over the laws of hell. When they went through the gate of the underworld, the main gate of the underworld in Canto 3, they passed easily through an open entrance. It was still unlocked, senza serame, in spite of the threatening dictum of that scritta morta. So even though Dante has read the famous inscription, per me si va nella città dolente, per me si va nell'eterno dolore, per me si va tra la perduta gente. He's also seen that the door has been knocked down dramatically, left open by the passage of Christ through human history. And in the image you can see the devil lying squashed flat underneath the gate and the locks bursting off. Something that Dante's language in the canto picks up on very nicely with the reference to the porta that's left senza serame, which echoes the church liturgy for Holy Saturday, speaking about the harrowing of hell, which celebrates how hodie portas mortis et seras pariter salvatar noster disrupit, the serame, seras, porta, portas. So just as the main entrance gate to hell itself can't any longer be closed after Christ's triumphant harrowing of hell, Virgil assures Dante character that by analogy, the gate of this lower circle will inevitably give way to a visit that has been divinely sanctioned. Dante will be able to carry out his own kind of harrowing of hell in his descent through the lower circles. God's authority is bound to override even the most logical norms of the organisation of hell. Canto VIII, of course, closes in suspense about how this will happen, and I'm sure that Claire's reading will remind us that it's not quite as straightforward as Virgil seems to promise in this canto. But he's correct in his confident assertion that the gate will, in the end, be opened. So Dante character is promised that they're going to successfully overcome this diabolic opposition and imitate Christ by forcing the gates of hell to be unlocked. And with this anticipation of the triumph of Christ, the vindication of the believers, we find a link with an episode from earlier in the canto on the approach towards Dis. I think inevitably for a medieval audience, the image of a virtuous Christian being excluded from a city that's being defended by the forces of evil, the forces of unbelief, an association would be made with the idea of crusade. And Dante poet does give us a hint in this canto at some kind of an analogue with the idea of crusading when he's on his way towards Dis. When Dante character looks out of Flegias's boat towards the walls of the infernal city, he describes the distant towers that he can see as mesquite, from the Arabic mesajid, mosques or minaret towers. ed io, maestro, già le sue meschite la entro certe nella valle Cerno, vermiglie come se di fuoco uscite fossero. By making these tall towers into the minarets of an Islamic city, Dante adds a further note of strangeness or moral danger to this description of this infernal town. In medieval Western tradition, Islam was held to be a heretical sect that originally derived from Christianity. And perhaps not coincidentally, the first sin that's encountered inside the city of Dis is precisely the sin of heresy. And in fact, notoriously, further on in the Inferno, much lower down among the worst sinners, the sinners who have created schism, we find the figures both of Muhammad and of Ali in Canto 28. But alongside the medieval popular image of Islam, there's not only this accusation that it's some kind of a bastardized version, breakaway version of Christianity. There are also assertions that it involves idolatry, analogous with classical pantheism, and it's specifically the worship of Muhammad as a deity. Obviously, to 21st century knowledge of Islam, this seems quite confused. But the commentary tradition shows us that these were prejudices that were shared by the early readers of Canto VIII. And many early commentators on the canto pick up on this single term, mesquite, to describe the minaret-like towers of Dis, and show that they have a sense that this symbolises the sinful and demonic qualities of the city's inhabitants because of the association with Islam. So I'm going to turn once again to Boccaccio, who typifies many of the commentaries. Mesquite chiamano I Saracini i luoghi dove vanno ad adorare, fatti ad onore di Maometto, come noi chiamiamo chiese quelle che ad onor di Dio facciamo. E perciò che questi cosifatti loti si sogliono fare più alti e più eminenti che gli edifici cittadini, è usanza di vederli piuttosto uno che fuori dalla città venga che le altre case. E perciò non fa l'autor menzione delle altre parti della città dolente, ma da questa sola, chiamandole meschite, siccome edifici composti ad onor del demonio e non di Dio. Later on in the Commedia, we're going to learn that Dante's position on Islam was given an additional strength by a supposed family connection, descent from a crusading hero, a figure who achieved glorious martyrdom in fighting in the Holy Land. So in that central section of Paradiso that I've already mentioned, in the Heaven of Mars, Dante character will encounter the soul of his great-great-grandfather, Cacciaguida, who tells the protagonist precisely about how he died in Palestine, fighting against la niquizia di quella legge in cui il popolo usurpa per colpe di pastor vostra giustizia. Qui vi fui io da quella gente turpa disviluppato dal mondo fallace, lo cui amor molt'anime deturpa, e venni dal martiro a questa pace. Here, obviously, a great deal earlier in the poem, Dante character's situation, in a sense, anticipates what we'll later learn about his ancestors. The Christian hero is engaged in a potentially fatal standoff with a gente turpa, with the devils who are enemies of legge and giustizia. And in fact, of course, in some ways, Dante's situation is a richer, deeper version of crusade than his ancestors, because he's confronting not just the human infidels, the Saracens in the Holy Land, but an army of fallen angels, the army of Lucifer, who rebelled directly against the Godhead out of sinful pride. So there's a distinct crusading aspect, hinted at by a single word, but one that clearly Dante's contemporary readership felt to be significant through this description of the towers as having a minaret-like aspect. But the lawlessness of the city, the fact that it is opposed to Christianity, is something that can be understood also from outside the Christian framework. And in fact, Virgil is a particularly competent commentator on the city of Dis. The reason for this may be that he explains, maybe that he recognises in the appearance of Dis many of the attributes of Tartarus, the city of sin, of crime, that he describes in his own epic, Aeneid. Of course, you will know that in Book 6 of the epic, Aeneas visits the underworld under the guidance of the Cumaean Sibyl, and sees the figure of his father, who predicts the glory of Rome. But en route to the Elysian fields, Aeneas passes by the city of Tartarus, a closed city which is a place of punishment for unrepentant criminals, including several of the kinds of characteristic sinners that Dante picks on so strongly in the Inferno, things like adultery, patricide, blasphemy, and so on, are represented by the figures of Tartarus. There's a physical resemblance between Dante's infernal city and Virgil's. The ditis magni moenia in the Aeneid are made of iron. The locked gate is guarded by defensive towers and by a forbidding doorkeeper. Porta adversa, ingen solidoque adamante columnae, visut nulla virum, non ipsi excindere bello, calicolae valeant, stat ferre turris ad auras, tisifoneque sedens palla succinta cruenta, vestibulum ex somnis servat noctesque diesque. So many of the terms are repeated. And in fact, we can note that Virgil, like Dante, suggests that while the main entrance gate to the underworld is always open, noctes atque dies, patet atri janua dites, the inner city of Tartarus, the city of crime, is kept permanently locked and firmly guarded. But as they pass by, even though the city is closed, the Sibyl lists for Aeneas some of the criminals who are being punished inside Tartarus, and they include another figure who's very familiar to readers of Canto VIII of the Inferno, Phlegyas. Phlegiasque miserimus omnis admonet, et magna testatur voce per umbras, discite justitiam moniti, et non temnere divos. Although Dante's version of Phlegyas is not exactly the same as the Virgilian one, the use of the name in a canto that also reproduces so much of the aspect of Tartarus, I think means that Dante invites his readers to recall particularly these words that are spoken by Phlegyas, according to the Sibyl, discite justitiam et non temnere divos. And I think that these words are extremely relevant to the political and the moral themes that are so strongly presented to us in Canto VIII, and that Dante expects those of his audience who know the Virgilian text to recall those words and to draw on them in their reflection on the material of this canto. It's a very simple two-part injunction. Discite justitiam, learn justice. Non temnere divos, do not scorn the gods. And each of these principles is applicable to both of the cities that we've been considering in reviewing the canto, the earthly city of Florence and also the infernal city of Dis. In the case of the infernal city, the injunction has to work by negatives, as of course it does also in the original context in the Aeneid. Both the infernal cities of Tartarus and of Dis are places of the afterlife, so the souls can no longer alter their habits to become just or to become God-fearing. In fact, they're being punished precisely because they failed to exercise those kinds of virtues during their life on earth. But we've already seen that Dante uses quite a lot of the material in Canto VIII to show that the principles of just law and the necessity of obedience to divine will can apply even to Dis, even to the rebellious inhabitants of this infernal city. Virgil's character promises the fearful Dante in the Inferno that the city's gate must be opened because the journey is divinely sanctioned. Non temer, che il nostro passo non ci può torre alcun, da tal ne dato. So the devil's attempts to apply the laws of hell to Dante's character and to exclude him from their city is guaranteed to fail. Their local law will be trumped by divine justice. In fact, when Virgil refers to the example of the open gates of upper hell, referring to its scritta morta, we know that it directly declares all of hell to be a product of divine justice, not of diabolical law. Giustizia mosse il mio alto fattore. God is the ultimate origin of the justice governing hell. So however much the devils may want to impose their own logical opposition to Virgil and Dante character, in Canto IX the door will open, the protagonist's journey will be able to proceed. And consequently, the devils themselves have to learn justice and fear God, to use Virgil's words, or at least even if by definition they themselves can't learn any moral lesson, they at least have to give recognition that these are the principles that validate the onward journey of the two protagonists. If we think back to the context of the Aeneid, those words spoken by Phlegyas, learn justice, do not scorn the gods, they only have one possible beneficiary. They're reported by the Sibyl to Aeneas, the living visitor to the underworld who's going to return to earthly life and will be able to enact those kinds of principles to benefit from the dark warning of Phlegyas. We know that Aeneas is a refugee from the proud city of Troy, which hubristically defied the will of the gods, but that he, because of his outstanding pietas, his sense of what is right, has been divinely appointed to revive the fallen city's destiny by travelling to Italy to found a new civilization that will give rise to Rome. And of course, that same Book 6 of the Aeneid involves the prediction by Anchises of just how great, splendid, and above all, how righteous in its law system Rome is going to be. In the Inferno, the story has already been summed up for Dante's character as a narrative directly concerned with those principles of pride destroyed and justice triumphant. Virgil, on his first appearance, stresses that cantai di quel giusto figliol d'Anchise che venne da Troia poiché il superbo Ilion fu combusto. It's a commonplace in Dante criticism to note that Virgil and Dante character in the Inferno reproduce the Sibyl and Aeneas from the Aeneid, and the early canti of the Inferno in particular bear a very close relationship with the journey to the underworld of Pius Aeneas. The desired similarities between Aeneas and Dante have a historical as well as a literary dimension, because in real life, Dante felt that he had similarities to Aeneas as a fellow exile, as a figure fervently dedicated to the idea of Rome and Roman law, and as a devoted follower of the principles of his religion. As concerns Canto VIII, both Aeneas's literary and historical significance as an exemplar for Dante are, I think, illumined by those words of the Virgilian Phlegyas. Justice and religiosity are both extravagantly absent from the civilization of Dante's earthly city. Florence, just like Troy, is a proud city, lacking in the principles of justice and of religion. But like Aeneas, Dante's character is fated to return to earth at the end of his journey through the afterlife. And like Aeneas, he will share with the living the lessons that have been learnt through his encounters with the dead. The primary lesson of the journey of the Commedia as a whole, is very evidently a lesson of spiritual renewal, of the need for selfless service of God. And Virgil's non temnere divos sums this up, I think, quite well, even if it is an expression that originates in classical pantheism. But discite justitiam, learn justice, is an equally urgent theme in the Commedia, and one that Dante poet returns to again and again as the comedy develops. We know that he emphatically stresses the idea that Roman law and Roman leadership offer the best opportunities for the realization of effective justice in human affairs on earth. Dante suggests that he, like a second Aeneas, must work to revive the values of a corrupted civilization from a position of exile. It's a task that has both a secular and a spiritual dimension. He will become a prophet of Rome and of Roman law as much as of God through the working out of the Commedia. Of course, in Canto VIII of the Inferno, a lot of this poetic work is still very much to be completed. And the canto itself, as I've said, will end on a provisional note, with the two protagonists waiting for the resolution of the impasse therein, with the gates of Dis shut against them. Justice and piety are held, at least temporarily, in abeyance by the opposition of the devils. At the start of the lecture, I noted how the opening of the canto, that io dico seguitando, as I was saying, gave rise to a legend that the poem itself had been disrupted temporarily by the hostility of the powerful Florentine families to Dante that resulted in his expulsion. That story of the lost manuscript sums all of that up. But I think that I hope that I've shown that the content of Canto VIII as a whole, not just the content of that opening line, is full of an exploration of the implications of that kind of Florentine injustice that was latent in Boccaccio and other commentators' versions of the legend. The belligerent resistance of the city of Dis to Dante character directly recalls the closing of the gates of Florence against the historical Dante in the political banishment. The struggle with Filippo Argenti, again, illustrates how that same banishment, like so many events in medieval Florentine politics, had its origins in anger, in pride, in the unjust prejudice of politics dominated by faction. But the legend of the manuscript being rediscovered, like the continuation of the journey in Canto IX, express Dante's confidence, or express a feeling that Florentine resistance, like infernal resistance, is something that could be overcome by the force of true justice. Famously, when Dante character gets to the very end of his journey in the Commedia and enters the supreme heaven of the Empyrean, he marks the contrast between the sublime realm and his earthly homeland through a reference to justice. Io, che al divino dall'umano, all'eterno del tempo era venuto, e di Fiorenza, in popol giusto e sano, di che stupor dove esser compiuto. So to conclude, I hope to have shown in the course of this talk that in the Inferno, Dante character and Virgil can be seen perhaps to anticipate that triumph of the Paradiso when they approach the city of Dis. It's not a purely negative episode. Virgil and Dante together are representatives both of secular Roman justice and of Christian righteousness. They become counterparts to Aeneas and to the Sibyl in the underworld, and of crusaders in the Holy Land, and even of Christ himself in the harrowing of hell. In this confrontation with the devils who are attempting to block their journey in Canto VIII, the demons are going to prove briefly successful in the immediate narrative circumstances, but they're destined inevitably to fail. In fact, unlike Aeneas, who passes by the city of Tartarus without going inside it, Dante's protagonists are going to enter the city of injustice after all. And there they're going to learn for themselves, and in detail, the consequences of ignoring Fleges's dictum, of what it means to defy divine and human law. So that's the theme that I think we can draw together at the end of the canto. And thank you very much for